Imagine standing on the edge of a frozen fjord in the year 793. The morning mist clings to the water like breath on glass. Suddenly, dragon-headed ships emerge from the fog, silent as ghosts, carrying warriors who would reshape the world without ever drawing a single permanent border on a map. This is the story of how the Vikings built an empire that defied every rule of empire building, an empire without borders, without capitals, without the traditional structures of power that defined civilizations for thousands of years. This is the story of how a people from the harsh, unforgiving north became the most influential force in medieval Europe, not by claiming land, but by claiming something far more valuable: connection, movement, and the freedom to exist everywhere and nowhere all at once. The Vikings didn't conquer the world in the way Rome did, or the way Alexander the Great dreamed of doing. They didn't plant flags and declare dominion over territories with rigid boundaries. They didn't build walls to keep people out or roads to tie provinces together under a single throne. Instead, they created something far more revolutionary, far more terrifying to their enemies, and far more effective than any empire that came before or after. They built a network, a web of influence that stretched from the frozen wastes of Greenland to the golden domes of Constantinople, from the green hills of Ireland to the vast rivers of Russia. They were merchants and warriors, explorers and settlers, poets and pragmatists. They moved like water, filling every gap, flowing into every opportunity, adapting to every landscape while never losing their identity. And in doing so, they proved that you don't need borders to build an empire. You just need to be everywhere that matters. To understand how the Vikings achieved this, we need to go back to the beginning, to the harsh reality that forged them. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was not a paradise. The winters were brutal, the growing season short, and the land itself seemed determined to resist human settlement. Mountains of stone and ice dominated the landscape. Forests grew dark and thick, filled with wolves and bears. The sea was violent and unpredictable, capable of swallowing entire communities in a single storm. For most of human history, this environment would have kept people isolated, trapped, limited. But the Scandinavians looked at their impossible homeland and saw something different. They saw possibility. Where others saw barriers, they saw highways. The sea, that great killer, became their greatest ally. The very harshness of their environment became their training ground, their forge, their reason for becoming something more than farmers waiting for crops to grow. The longship was the key that unlocked everything. It wasn't just a boat. It was a revolution in engineering, a masterpiece of design that took centuries to perfect. The Viking longship was shallow enough to navigate rivers, fast enough to outrun any vessel of its time, sturdy enough to cross the open Atlantic, and light enough to be carried over land when necessary. It could land on any beach, slip up any waterway, and disappear before defenders could mount a response. The longship gave the Vikings something no other civilization possessed at that time: total mobility. They weren't bound by roads or supply lines or the need for deep harbors. They could appear anywhere, strike with devastating efficiency, and vanish before retaliation was possible. This single innovation transformed a scattered collection of farming communities into the most formidable raiding force Europe had ever seen. But more than that, it transformed them into something unprecedented: a civilization without fixed geography, a culture that existed in motion. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 announced the Vikings to the world in the most dramatic way possible. Lindisfarne was a monastery on a small island off the northeast coast of England, a holy place filled with treasures, manuscripts, and monks who had dedicated their lives to God. It was considered safe, protected by the sanctity of the church and the isolation of its location. Then, on a June morning, dragon ships appeared. Warriors poured onto the beach. The monastery was pillaged, monks were killed or taken as slaves, and the sacred objects that had been accumulating for generations were loaded onto ships and carried away. The attack lasted hours. The shock would last centuries. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror, describing omens that preceded the raid: whirlwinds, lightning, and dragons flying through the air. To the Christian world, it seemed as if hell itself had opened and unleashed demons upon the earth. But this wasn't random violence. It was calculated, strategic, and deeply pragmatic. The Vikings had been watching. They knew about the wealth concentrated in monasteries. They understood that these religious institutions were poorly defended because no one had dared to attack them before. They recognized an opportunity that others had overlooked because of cultural taboos and religious reverence. The Vikings were not bound by those same beliefs. They worshipped different gods, gods of war and sea and storm, gods who rewarded boldness and cunning. So they took what others were too afraid or too pious to take. And in doing so, they revealed something profound about their worldview: nothing was off limits, no target too sacred, no distance too far. If wealth existed somewhere, they would find a way to reach it. What followed was not a single conquest but a cascade of raids, settlements, and integrations that spread across Europe like roots beneath the soil. The pattern was consistent and devastating. Viking raiders would appear suddenly, strike vulnerable targets, and disappear before organized resistance could form. They targeted monasteries and trading centers, places where wealth accumulated and defenses were weak. They moved inland along rivers, using their shallow draft ships to reach places that no other naval force could access. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Thames, these great rivers became highways into the heart of European kingdoms. Cities that had stood for centuries suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Paris was besieged multiple times. The Vikings learned, adapted, and evolved their tactics with every encounter. When they met strong resistance, they negotiated. When they found weakness, they exploited it ruthlessly. They were not ideologues fighting for a cause. They were opportunists pursuing profit, land, adventure, and glory. But here's where the story becomes more complex and more interesting. The Vikings were not just raiders. That's the image that has dominated popular imagination, the savage Northmen descending on peaceful communities with axes and torches. But the reality was far more nuanced. Yes, they raided. Yes, they killed and plundered and terrified. But they also traded, negotiated, settled, married, and integrated. The same Vikings who burned monasteries in England also established trading posts in Dublin that would become one of the great commercial centers of medieval Europe. The same warriors who extorted silver from Frankish kings also founded the Duchy of Normandy, which would eventually produce the conquerors of England in 1066. The same seafarers who terrorized coastal communities also discovered and settled Iceland, Greenland, and briefly, North America, pushing the boundaries of the known world further than anyone had dared before. This duality, this ability to shift between warrior and merchant, between destroyer and builder, was central to Viking success. They were not locked into a single identity or purpose. They adapted to circumstances with remarkable fluidity. In some places, they conquered. In others, they traded. In still others, they simply absorbed into local populations, bringing their shipbuilding skills, their trading networks, and their warrior culture into the existing society. This flexibility meant that Viking influence spread in multiple ways simultaneously, creating a presence that was both pervasive and difficult to define. They were not building an empire in the traditional sense, with a capital city and subject provinces. They were creating a web of Viking-influenced communities, trading networks, and cultural exchanges that spanned thousands of miles. And because this web was not tied to any single center of power, it was nearly impossible to destroy. Consider the Viking activity in the East, a story that often gets less attention than their western raids but is equally remarkable. Swedish Vikings, known as the Russ, traveled south and east along the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They established trading posts, married into local Slavic populations, and eventually founded political entities that would evolve into medieval Russian states. The name Russia itself likely derives from the Rus Vikings. They connected Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, creating trade routes that moved furs, slaves, amber, and honey south, while bringing back silver, silk, and exotic goods from the Mediterranean and beyond. The Vikings didn't just trade with these civilizations, they served as mercenaries in Byzantine armies, forming the elite Varangian Guard that protected emperors in Constantinople. They carved runes into the railings of the Hagia Sophia. They left graffiti that essentially says, "Halfdan was here," in one of the most sacred Christian sites in the world. They were everywhere, participating in everything, but never fully belonging to any single kingdom or empire. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking culture, their relationship with identity and belonging. The Vikings were not defined by where they came from in the way that most medieval people were. A typical medieval peasant would likely never travel more than a few miles from their birthplace. Their identity, their social position, their entire existence was tied to a specific piece of land. But Vikings moved. They moved constantly, deliberately, restlessly. A Viking might be born in Norway, raid in England, trade in Ireland, settle in Iceland, and end up serving in the Byzantine Emperor's Guard in Constantinople. Their identity was not geographic but cultural and kinship-based. They were Vikings not because of where they lived but because of who they were related to, what gods they worshipped, what language they spoke, and what stories they told. This portable identity allowed them to maintain cohesion even when spread across vast distances. A Viking in Dublin and a Viking in Kiev might never meet, but they were connected by language, by mythology, by social structures, and increasingly, by trade networks that linked their communities. The sagas, those great narrative poems passed down through generations, played a crucial role in maintaining this cultural cohesion. These were not just entertainment, they were historical record, legal precedent, genealogical record, and moral instruction all woven together. They told of heroes and villains, of feuds and alliances, of journeys to distant lands and returns home with treasure and glory. They established cultural values, courage, loyalty, cunning, generosity, and reputation. In Viking society, reputation was everything. How you were remembered mattered more than how long you lived. A good death in battle was preferable to a long life without deeds worth singing about. This cultural emphasis on reputation and storytelling meant that Vikings were constantly aware they were part of a larger narrative. Their actions would be judged not just by their immediate community but by future generations who would hear their stories. This created a powerful incentive for bold action, for pushing boundaries, for attempting the impossible. It also meant that Viking culture could survive and propagate even without centralized institutions or permanent settlements. As long as people told the stories, the culture remained alive. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked when people discuss the Vikings: their genius for adaptation and integration. The popular image is of Vikings as outsiders, as invaders who remained separate from the cultures they encountered. But the historical reality is far more complex. Vikings were remarkably good at becoming part of the societies they entered, while simultaneously changing those societies in profound ways. In Normandy, Vikings who had been raiding France for decades accepted land from the French king in 911, agreed to convert to Christianity, and became French-speaking nobles. Within a few generations, they were so thoroughly integrated that they were essentially French. But they brought with them their warrior culture, their administrative skills, and their ambition. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy, a descendant of those Vikings, conquered England. The Norman conquest transformed England politically, linguistically, and culturally. The English language itself is a testament to this blending, with Old Norse words forming a substantial portion of modern English vocabulary. Words like sky, knife, window, husband, law, and even they, them, and their come from Old Norse. The Vikings didn't just raid England, they fundamentally altered what it meant to be English. This pattern repeated across Europe. In Ireland, Vikings founded Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These were not raiding camps, they were permanent trading cities that became vital economic centers. Irish kings sometimes allied with Viking forces against other Irish kings, blurring the lines between native and foreign. In Sicily, Vikings from Normandy conquered the island from Muslim and Byzantine rulers, creating a multicultural kingdom that blended Norman, Italian, Greek, and Arabic influences into something entirely new. The Vikings were not preserving some pure Scandinavian culture everywhere they went. They were blending, adapting, taking what worked from local cultures and adding their own elements. This cultural flexibility was itself a source of power. It meant they could operate effectively in vastly different contexts, from the tribal structures of Slavic territories to the sophisticated bureaucracies of the Byzantine Empire. The Viking expansion into the North Atlantic is perhaps the most extraordinary chapter in this story of borderless empire building. Iceland was discovered and settled by Norwegian Vikings seeking to escape political consolidation under King Harald Fairhair. They established a society that was consciously designed to avoid the centralized kingship they had left behind. The Althing, established in 930, was one of the world's oldest parliaments, a gathering where free men could air grievances, settle disputes, and make collective decisions. This was Viking democracy, rough and imperfect, but genuine. From Iceland, Vikings pushed further west, discovering Greenland, which despite its misleading name was largely ice-covered. Eric the Red established settlements there around 985. His son, Leif Erikson, went even further, reaching the coast of North America around the year 1000, 500 years before Columbus. They called it Vinland. They built structures, attempted settlement, and had violent encounters with indigenous peoples they called Skraelings. The North American settlement didn't last, but the fact that it happened at all is staggering. Using only wind and currents, reading stars and observing birds, the Vikings crossed one of the most treacherous oceans on Earth and established a presence on 3 continents: Europe, Greenland, and briefly, North America. These voyages required extraordinary courage, but also extraordinary knowledge. Viking navigation is one of the great technological achievements of the medieval world. Without compasses, without maps as we would recognize them, Viking sailors crossed vast stretches of open ocean with remarkable accuracy. They used the sun's position, star observations, ocean currents, wind patterns, the flight of birds, the color and temperature of water, and possibly even natural phenomena like the refraction of sunlight through calcite crystals, the legendary sunstones mentioned in sagas. Recent research suggests these sunstones could have helped Vikings locate the sun's position even when it was obscured by clouds or fog, which would have been a tremendous navigational advantage in northern latitudes. They also used dead reckoning, constantly calculating speed, time, and direction to estimate position. This required not just technical knowledge but an almost intuitive feel for the sea, a deep understanding accumulated over generations of seafaring. The Vikings didn't just get lucky crossing the Atlantic. They developed genuine expertise, a sophisticated body of knowledge that allowed them to treat the ocean not as an impassable barrier but as a highway to opportunity. Let's pause here and consider what this all means in terms of empire building. Traditional empires were built on control of territory. Rome conquered land, built roads, established garrisons, imposed law, and extracted taxes. The empire was the territory it controlled, and that control was maintained through military force and administrative structure. When Rome fell, the empire ended because the structures that defined it collapsed. But the Viking Empire, if we can even call it that, worked differently. It was built on networks rather than territory, on connections rather than control. A Viking trader in York was connected to Vikings in Dublin, who were connected to Vikings in Iceland, who maintained ties to communities in Norway. These connections were based on family relationships, shared language and culture, mutual economic interest, and occasionally, allegiance to particularly powerful leaders. But there was no central authority, no Viking emperor issuing decrees from a throne. Power was distributed, decentralized, fluid. This made the Viking world remarkably resilient. You couldn't destroy it by conquering a capital city because there was no capital. You couldn't cut off the head of the snake because it didn't have a head, or rather, it had many heads, and they operated semi-independently. This decentralized structure also meant that Viking influence persisted long after the Viking Age officially ended. Historians typically date the Viking Age from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when the last great Viking invasion of England was defeated. But Viking cultural, genetic, and political influence didn't end in 1066. It continued for centuries in forms that were sometimes visible and sometimes subtle. The Normans who conquered England were Vikings who had become French, but their conquest was driven by Viking ambition and executed with Viking ruthlessness. The Kingdom of Sicily founded by Norman Vikings lasted until the 19th century. The Varangian Guard served Byzantine emperors until Constantinople fell in 1453. The Icelandic Commonwealth maintained its unique political structure for centuries. The trade networks established by Vikings continued to operate, evolving and adapting but maintaining threads of connection that had been established during the Viking Age proper. In this sense, the Viking Empire never really fell because it was never really a single entity that could fall. It was a phenomenon, a moment when Scandinavian maritime culture achieved such momentum and reach that it transformed medieval Europe and beyond. But we should also talk about what this expansion cost. The Viking success story is filled with violence, slavery, and destruction. When we marvel at their ships and their navigation, we shouldn't forget that these tools were often used for brutal raids that destroyed communities and lives. The Vikings were enthusiastic participants in the medieval slave trade, capturing people from raids and selling them across their trading networks. The Arabic silver that archaeologists find in Scandinavian graves was often purchased with human beings. The freedom and opportunity that Viking culture offered to its own members was built partly on the unfreedom and exploitation of others. The sagas celebrate heroes who were often, by any moral standard, murderers and thieves. The cultural values that drove exploration and achievement also celebrated violence and vengeance. This is the paradox at the heart of Viking history, a people who created remarkable things while also inflicting tremendous suffering, who pushed boundaries while trampling on others, who built connections while breaking communities. Understanding this complexity is essential to understanding how the Vikings built their borderless empire. They succeeded partly because they were willing to do things others would not do, to ignore moral and religious boundaries that constrained other medieval peoples. They succeeded because they were flexible and pragmatic in ways that more rigidly structured societies were not. They succeeded because they moved when others stood still, adapted when others resisted change, and saw opportunities where others saw only danger or taboo. These were tremendous advantages. But they came with moral costs that we should not ignore or romanticize. The Viking Age was not a noble adventure story. It was a complex, morally ambiguous period in which some people used technological innovation, courage, and cultural flexibility to achieve extraordinary things while also causing extraordinary harm. Both realities can be true simultaneously. By the 11th century, the Viking world was changing fundamentally. Christianity was spreading through Scandinavia, bringing with it new values, new political structures, and new connections to the rest of Christian Europe. Kings were consolidating power in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, creating more centralized states that looked increasingly like the kingdoms the Vikings had once raided. The age of the independent sea king, the adventurer who might gather a crew and set out for fortune, was ending. The professional raider was being replaced by the royal fleet serving monarchs with territorial ambitions. Trade was becoming more regularized, less chaotic, more embedded in formal agreements between kingdoms. The Christianization of Iceland in the year 1000, decided by a vote at the Althing, symbolized this transformation. Vikings were choosing to join the broader European community, to adopt its religion and eventually its political forms, to become subjects of kingdoms rather than members of loose kinship networks. Does this mean the Viking experiment failed? Not at all. It means it succeeded so thoroughly that it transformed into something else. The Vikings didn't disappear, they became Normans, Russians, Icelanders, Irish Norse, English nobles, Byzantine guards, and eventually, simply Europeans. Their genetic legacy is widespread across Northern Europe and beyond. Their cultural legacy includes legal traditions, linguistic borrowings, place names, and stories that are still told 1,000 years later. Their navigational achievements paved the way for later European oceanic exploration. Their trade networks helped connect medieval Europe in ways that facilitated the economic growth of later centuries. Their political innovations, like the Icelandic Althing or the urban institutions they established in places like Dublin, influenced how medieval and modern societies organized themselves. The Vikings built an empire without borders by being everywhere and then becoming part of everywhere they went. Let's consider some specific examples that illustrate this legacy. The city of Dublin, founded by Vikings in 841, became Ireland's most important urban center and remains its capital today. The parliamentary tradition in Iceland, established by Vikings seeking to avoid kingship, evolved into one of the world's oldest continuous legislative assemblies. The administrative and military innovations that Vikings brought to Normandy helped make it one of the most effective warrior states in medieval Europe, capable of conquering England and establishing kingdoms in the Mediterranean. The trade routes they established connected regions that had little previous contact, facilitating exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The Viking expansion into Russia created political entities and trade connections that linked Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world, helping to break down the isolation of early medieval Europe. Even the Viking raids, destructive as they were, forced European kingdoms to improve their defenses, centralize authority, and develop more sophisticated military and administrative structures. The Vikings were a catalyst for change across medieval Europe. There's also a psychological and cultural legacy that's harder to quantify but equally important. The Viking Age demonstrated that the world was not as fixed as people had believed, that distant lands could be reached, that established powers could be challenged, that bold action could reshape reality. This was a profound shift in mentality. Medieval Europe was largely static and hierarchical, with rigid social structures and limited social mobility. The Vikings showed that individuals could rise through courage and cunning, that crews of free men could achieve what kingdoms struggled to accomplish, that the edge of the world was not as close as people thought. This example, this demonstration of possibility, influenced medieval European culture in ways that are difficult to trace but undoubtedly real. The Vikings expanded the mental map of what was possible, and that expansion lived on even after the Vikings themselves had blended into the populations they once raided and traded with. Now, as we approach the end of this story, let's return to the central question: how did the Vikings build an empire without borders? We can summarize it this way. They recognized that in their time and place, mobility was more valuable than territory. They developed the technology to achieve unprecedented mobility. They created a cultural identity that was portable, based on kinship and shared stories rather than geography. They were flexible enough to adapt to diverse circumstances, shifting between roles as raiders, traders, settlers, and mercenaries as opportunity dictated. They maintained networks rather than hierarchies, connections rather than rigid control structures. They were willing to take risks that others avoided, to push boundaries that others respected, to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles or taboos. And ultimately, they succeeded not by conquering and holding territory, but by becoming part of so many places that their influence became permanent even as their distinct identity gradually dissolved. This is a fundamentally different model of empire than the territorial model that dominated ancient and medieval history. It's arguably more modern in some ways, prefiguring the networked, decentralized structures that characterize globalization today. The Vikings didn't build an empire of space, they built an empire of connection, of movement, of cultural influence and economic integration. They proved that you don't need to conquer the world to change it, that presence and participation can be more powerful than domination, that being everywhere matters more than controlling anywhere. This is why the Viking story remains compelling more than 1,000 years after their longships last appeared on European horizons. They accomplished something that seems almost impossible. They built an empire by refusing to be bound by borders, by embracing movement and change rather than resisting it, by adapting rather than imposing, by connecting rather than conquering. Think about what this means for how we understand power and influence. We're taught to think of empires as things on maps, colored territories with borders and capitals. We think of power as control, as the ability to command and enforce. But the Vikings show us a different kind of power, the power of presence without permanence, of influence without institutionalization, of legacy without clear ownership. They were never the most numerous people or the wealthiest civilization or the most technologically advanced society. But for several centuries, they were the most dynamic, the most far-reaching, the most willing to embrace uncertainty and change. And that dynamism, that willingness to move and adapt, gave them an influence that outlasted every kingdom and empire of their time. Consider also what the Viking story tells us about culture and identity. In an age when most people never traveled far from their birthplace, when identity was tied to specific pieces of land, the Vikings created a culture that could exist anywhere. They proved that identity doesn't require geography, that communities can persist through movement and change, that you can be fully yourself while also adapting to new circumstances. This was revolutionary in the 9th century. It's still relevant today in our globalized, mobile world where people routinely live far from where they were born, where identities are complex and multi-layered, where connection matters more than location. The Vikings were ahead of their time in understanding that culture is portable, that networks can be more resilient than fortresses, that movement can be a form of strength rather than a source of vulnerability. There's also a lesson here about the limits of categorization. We want to classify the Vikings as either raiders or traders, as either destroyers or builders, as either outsiders or insiders. But they were all of these things, often simultaneously. They raided one coast and traded with the next. They destroyed monasteries and founded cities. They were foreign invaders who became local nobility within a generation. This complexity, this refusal to fit neatly into categories, was part of their success. It allowed them to operate in multiple spheres, to take advantage of opportunities that more narrowly defined groups would miss. In a world that valued stability and clear social roles, the Vikings thrived by being fluid, by occupying multiple roles, by maintaining the freedom to shift identities and strategies as circumstances changed. This ambiguity was not a weakness but a source of tremendous strategic advantage. As we stand here now, more than 1,000 years after the Viking Age ended, we can see its effects everywhere, even if they're not always obvious. Every time you use a word with Old Norse origins, you're speaking a language shaped by Viking influence. Every time you visit Iceland, Ireland, Normandy, or Russia, you're walking on land where Vikings left permanent marks. Every time we celebrate exploration, maritime courage, or the possibility of individuals rising through bold action, we're drawing on cultural narratives that the Vikings helped establish. They are woven into European and North American culture in ways that are now so fundamental that we barely notice them. This is the ultimate victory of the borderless empire, to become so integrated, so essential, that your influence becomes invisible, taken for granted, simply part of the world as it is. The Vikings understood something profound that many more powerful civilizations missed, that in a world of borders, the people who can move freely between those borders have a unique advantage. That in a world of rigid hierarchies, flexibility is revolutionary. That in a world that values permanence and stability, the ability to adapt and change is the greatest strength of all. They built an empire not by drawing lines on maps but by erasing them, by proving that influence doesn't require sovereignty, that legacy doesn't require permanence, that you can change the world without ever settling down long enough to build a palace or a capital city. They were raiders and traders, explorers and settlers, destroyers and builders, outsiders and insiders, all at once. And in being all of these contradictory things simultaneously, they created something unprecedented, an empire that existed everywhere and nowhere, that had no borders because it needed none, that persisted by changing rather than by resisting change. So when you think about the Vikings, don't just picture warriors with horned helmets, which they didn't actually wear, charging into battle. Picture instead a vast web spanning thousands of miles, connecting hundreds of communities, carrying trade goods and stories and genetic legacy and cultural practices across oceans and continents. Picture longships appearing on every coast, Viking merchants in every major trading center, Norse words entering every language they encountered, Viking blood mixing into every population they touched. Picture not an empire of conquest but an empire of connection, not a hierarchy of power but a network of relationships, not a moment of dominance but a process of transformation that changed Europe forever. That's the true story of how the Vikings built an empire without borders. They did it by being everywhere, by becoming part of everything, by proving that the most lasting influence comes not from standing still and defending what you have, but from moving constantly, adapting endlessly, and connecting everything you touch into a web so vast and so fundamental that it can never be untangled. They didn't conquer the medieval world. They wove themselves into it so thoroughly that when the Viking Age ended, the world itself had become something new, something that would have been unrecognizable to the people standing on those monastery walls in 793, watching dragon-headed ships emerge from the morning fog. The Vikings didn't just raid Europe. They helped create the Europe we know today, one connection, one journey, one settlement, one trade route at a time. And they did it all without ever drawing a single permanent border on the map.